All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. Welcome to Emancipations podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Tudd. I'm very pleased to welcome back Robert Beshara, who the last time we spoke, Robert, it was in regards to your innovative work in the field of decolonial psychoanalysis and the thought of Edward Said, as well as your work on Islamophobia. I think we actually talked about some of my work on that topic as well. Um, Today we're going to take a deep dive into Robert's latest book, one of his latest books. Robert Beshara is actually a quite prolific Lacanian thinker and author and musician. He's based in New Mexico, Northern New Mexico College, which is a, a state institution that serves Hispanic primarily, but also other immigrant populations
Native Americans.
and Native American and working class populations in New Mexico. Um, and Robert is sort of a prominent thinker on what I have talked about on this show as the Lacanian left. Has really done a lot of work that I think is at the intersection of critical theory, Marxist analysis, and pushing a new paradigm for thinking about um, race, colonialism, neo-colonialism, decolonial thought. This is a very fecund field of intellectual production these days, and I always benefit a lot from reading your work. Today we're speaking about the following text here: a psychoanalytic biography of Ye, the artist formerly known as Kanye West, the legacy of unconditional love. Um, and this is a psychoanalytic biography of what Robert says towards the end of the book, one of the most important philosophers in America today. So you're going to have to defend that claim. And obviously, the book has a very interesting preface, sort of intro from Tommy Curry, who is a very interesting thinker in his own right, an author that focuses on Black male studies and situates the text in that context very well. So Ye has become a polarizing figure because in 2022 or even before, really starting with 2016, Kanye went off the deep end. He abandoned his sort of loose commitment to American liberal tradition and he became a conservative. But over time, this led him to become an outright Trump supporter, or even to the right of Trump, by associating with these very strange neo-fascist reactionary groups like Nick Fuentes, for example. So what we want to do is get a sense of how psychoanalysis can help us understand biography. That's my first question, Robert, which is when looking at biography, right? Maybe we can say in general before we get into the case of Ye. Why did you feel compelled to say this requires a psychoanalytic reading?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks, Daniel, for the introduction, and I'm happy to be back on the podcast. And just so people don't get upset, as Bishara, the correct pronunciation. But anyways, to answer your question, I think I wasn't a fan of back then. He was called Kanye West before he was Ye. I wasn't a fan until 2016, and I actually got hooked because of him experiencing what was called back then a nervous breakdown, but which I read as a psychotic break. But to answer your question more directly, I was not satisfied with how the public and the media were dealing with his case. So basically, they either framed him as someone who is ranting, doesn't make any sense. So again, for someone with psychoanalytic ears, I'm committed to the ethics of listening carefully to what he's saying. So I actually went to those speeches that he gave during the St. Pablo tour, transcribed them, listened to them carefully, and that became kind of the beginning of the rabbit hole for me. So to offer an alternative reading that doesn't just dismiss him as ranting, but to actually try to get to the structure of his subjectivity, And the key to that, obviously, and this is why the psychoanalytic biographical method is important, is to listen to the unconscious. So most analyses of Ye before then were kind of looking at him as a narcissist, focusing too much on his megalomania, which again, I don't think is the correct reading. Um, and we can talk about the function of the ego and its subjectivity if you want, but I was more interested in, again, the unconscious, listening to that, and try to make sense of what appears to be nonsense, right? To interpret that. So that's what I was curious about.
Very interesting. Thank you, Robert. So do you then feel that um, one can only make a psychoanalytic biography on condition that you have available, like, the capacity to analyze the speech? Because one of the most famous psychoanalytic biographies is by a former student of Jacques Lacan by the name of John Laplanche, which is on Holderlin. And obviously, this biography was very significant because it put forward this idea of psychosis and creativity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And showed that if we track the moment that Holderlin wrote this, his most celebrated poetic novel called The Hyperion, um, we can understand that at the moment at which his psychotic break sort of occurred, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he actually had to like move back in with his mother. And so he, Laplanche offers all of that rich, almost like structural analysis. So can you talk about like what material as a biographer, this is your first biography, right?
Mm, it is.
Um, what material is necessary? Like, for example, you're dealing with a hip hop artist.
Mm-hmm.
So and now Kanye is not known in hip hop as a great freestyler. And he even confesses that in the Netflix documentary that he's not that good at it.
Mm-hmm.
But in your view, would freestyling qualify as tapping into like a type of speech that would, because
Right.
I feel like speech that is conditioned by what Freud called free association is
Mm-hmm.
unique. That's
Mm-hmm.
very unique because that's probably going to give you a closer capacity to address the question of unconscious
Mm.
desire,
Yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah. So again, the entry for me and the model for me was for the method was Freud's autobiographical study, but also his psychoanalytic biography of Leonardo da Vinci. So, and he looked at Da Vinci's diaries and things like that, where Da Vinci actually wrote about his dreams. So he had a lot of rich material to analyze. But going back to Ye, again, in 2016, during the St. Pablo tour, and this is important to kind of contextualize what happened at the time, um, and it marks a turning point in his career. I think it's the turning point from the old Kanye to the new Kanye. And it's also when he has the major psychotic break on stage in front of an audience. And the reason is that he was on stage and then he was informed that his wife then, Kim Kardashian, was in this hostage situation in Paris. So she probably almost lost her life in that situation. She was in Paris, and these thieves were following, Keeping Up with the Kardashians, the reality TV show, and they figured out where she would be, which hotel, and then they basically uh, um had her in a hostage situation. And so he was informed of that on stage during a concert. So imagine the effect that it had on him. And so within this context, and the larger political context was, of course, the 2016 presidential election, which was very polarizing. I say it's hyper polarizing for someone with sort of already a sensitive subjectivity, because the psychotic subjectivity is something that is there from the beginning, but stressful environmental factors basically would eventually lead to a break. And then you would see worsening of symptoms over time, which is what we see with Ye. So in 2016, he gave these speeches during the concert, and there are two of them that were filmed by basically fans. So they were uploaded to YouTube. And those are the ones that were dismissed as rants, but then I got very curious about them as rich material because he's pre-associating as he's having this psychotic break. So then that was the beginning of my analysis. I wanted to start from some like an empirical basis, and then construct his subjectivity backward and forward from that moment. So to kind of make sense of how did he get there, what is happening there, and I can say more about, again, because foreclosure is a big aspect here. I can talk more about that if you want. But yeah, basically, those speeches were very much free associative.
That's important. Yeah, I do want to understand Ye's subjectivity and psychosis and bipolar. I think he was recording something in Jackson Hole, Wyoming,
Hmm.
in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, and he wrote that he suffers from being bipolar, and this concept of bipolar and the highs and lows, as well as what you ultimately drive at, which I think is a brilliant thesis, right? Which is around Ye's relationship to his own blackness and to these kind of polarities of
Hmm.
what you call universal hate and universal love,
Hmm. Hmm.
which I want to invite you to break down, because what ultimately Robert is sort of suggesting is that Ye should be understood as bipolar, as manic depressive, but also that the strength of his genius is found in this, what you call an alchemy, right? He's an
Hmm.
alchemist.
Hmm.
Yeah. He's an alchemist who's capable of taking these extremes, um, self-defeat, failure, rejection. His first album is obviously College Dropout, and sort of converting them into
Hmm.
something far, far greater. So can you take a step back and
Hmm.
talk about, obviously we know that in 2007 his mother dies
Hmm.
randomly, accidentally, tragically. Um, and then you just said a moment ago that this is a debate within the psychoanalytic community. Is
Hmm.
psychosis something caused from environmental factors, or is there something born at birth? That's a whole, we don't need to get into that debate.
Hmm.
People are kind of split on it, right? Um, Tell us more about like the subjective, like, for lack of a better word, structure of
Hmm.
Ye, and you can kind of take that as you wish.
Yes. So yeah, Donda West, his mom, who was also his manager, she died in 2007 from plastic surgery complications, and he blames himself for that because he feels him being famous and moving to LA and being influenced by that kind of culture is what led her to seek that, and so he feels actually responsible somehow for her death. And I talk about because bipolar disorder is the sort of DSM version of the older psychoanalytic concept of manic depression, which is what I'm more interested in. So obviously the beginning of that is mourning and melancholia from Freud, and it's important to distinguish between mourning and melancholia because mourning would be the case of grieving someone close to you, like his mom. But melancholia is when you actually grieving a loss of self, which is, again, which exacerbates the depression, and then explains how mania is an intervention to take him out of depression. Because like the melancholia is so strong that could easily lead to suicide, and he does in his music and his speeches talk about suicidal ideation. And so the mania, which by the way is read often as narcissism or megalomania, but is actually more on the side of the unconscious. It's it's a strategy from the unconscious to kind of save him from the melancholia. But going back to your question, so his parents, Donda and Ray, they separated when he was before he was born, but they officially got divorced 3 years after he was born. So the reason being that Ray decided to pick his career in photography. They were living in Atlanta at the time, over raising a child. So basically, Donda was like, okay, well, I'm moving to Chicago. and she pursued an academic career at Chicago State University, and she raised Kanye on her own. So in a sense, that's important because then you have the absence of the father and you have an overpresence of the mother. And overpresence, of course, as we know from Lacan, is a great cause for anxiety. So there's an ambivalent relationship here, which is important to highlight. So if we go back to the beginning of his career, 2004, with the release of College Dropout, you'll see that's the first foreclosure, I would say. I'll punctuate that as the foreclosure of the symbolic father being Donda in this case. So, and this is represented by his anti-intellectualism. He's a college dropout while his mom is the chair of the English department. So in many ways, there's a lot of this. Again, the simple reading is to read him as someone who loves his mom so much, and this is true. But also, what is the significance of the first album being the college dropout, given that his mom is the chair of the English department, right? It's clearly a message for her as well. So it's an anti-intellectual stance. And later on, he says actually that he doesn't read and he finds reading kind of like eating broccoli or something like that. So the anti-intellectual or irrational stance is, I would read it as a foreclosure of the symbolic father. And then another punctuation, I would say, in 2016 with the sort of the psychotic break that I mentioned, this is what I would say is the foreclosure of the real father. So already Ray, his father, his biological father, is absent, but Ray symbolically, unconsciously, represents radicalism for Ye, because he was a member of the Black Panther Party, and in many ways represents leftism, not just liberalism, but something stronger than that, right? Black power. And so 2016 with the presidential election, Trump versus Clinton, again, there's an ambivalent moment here, which is paradoxical, is that Ye says that he endorses Trump, but he doesn't vote for him. But then he also donates money to Hillary Clinton's campaign. So again, it's very ambiguous how to read that, right? But basically, the way I would read it is an anti-radical position. It is definitely a right-wing position, and as you suggested early on, I would say it's further right from Trump, because he actually later on, after identifying with Trump for some time, he ends up clashing with him, and there's documentation that they had a fight, and basically he's further right from him, kind of on Nick Fuentes' side, Christian nationalism. So there's a third moment, if you allow me, which is the foreclosure of the imaginary father. So Christianity is obviously a big theme for Ye, and that's something related to the legacy of unconditional love that you asked me about. So this is the legacy of the Black Church. It's the legacy of liberation, Black liberation. It's the legacy of emancipation, to refer to your podcast, which is the legacy of you may have been a slave, but still there's God's love, which affirms your being, your existence, so that you're worthy. And this is why you keep fighting. You're fighting for your humanity. And that's the legacy of unconditional love that's kind of passed down through the Black church. And of course, the Black church is connected also to the kind of genres that we get from Black music, whether it's blues, soul, or what have you, funk, all of these genres that basically Ye indexes in his music. So that's something that's I refer to it as a discourse that's passed on from his mom, and that was very influential in how I was reading him. But anyways, in 2022, there's the foreclosure of the imaginary father. Uh, in other words, Christianity, God, Jesus. But we see already hints of that from his name for himself as Jesus, right? Why is he? And my reading of that, again, it's a little bit Nietzschean. Read it as an antichrist move, and connected to the fascist turn from 2022. So he actually starts sort of a cult called Sunday Service around 2019. And, it was very positive and inspiring, even though it came across as a cult. Music was central in that form of spirituality, the chorus, right? And the collective experience. But then he abandons that all of a sudden And there's this whole shift that happens in 2022 with the anti-Semitism, and also moving away from this sort of, I would say, Christian radicalism that his mom represented, which I would say is the legacy of unconditional love, to this other direction, which I would refer to more as antichrist.
Those of us that are old enough to remember Hurricane Katrina will know that Kanye made his mark on the public discourse regarding this event by
Hmm.
saying George Bush hates black people.
Doesn't care about black people. Yeah.
Didn't he say? Does he say hate or doesn't care?
I think he says doesn't care about black people.
Okay. Well, so this draws me to like how the bipolar structure extends Ye's own conception of like the collective subject, whether that be like the black subject or like his theory of the universal generic subject of
Mm,
modern life. Because again, Robert's claim is that Ye is one of the great philosophers of our time.
hmm
Tell me about that, please. Tell me about these polarities of universalism, of universal hate on the one hand, and how this leads to what many would interpret
Right.
as Ye's libertarianism, right?
hmm
Because he has a libertarian streak that seems to only intensify, right?
hmm
What I mean by that is that most of the time his message is very much a very very militant, pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Yes.
Um, Slavery seems like a choice,
Yeah.
yeah. Uh, People didn't hear it that way, right? Like just like this, the George Bush comment,
hmm
I heard it unequivocally, just like the slavery comment, I heard it unequivocally.
hmm
That goes actually back to this bipolar universalism,
Yeah.
right? So if love is universal, hate is also universal, and therefore, like the black subject, according to Ye, has to find the means
Mm,
to transcend hate that has been imposed upon them, but ultimately that is a voluntarist hate as well.
hmm hmm
So tell us about tell us about this transposition. And here I would say this is where he becomes something like a philosopher of subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, so the legacy of unconditional love, I talked a little bit about that. That's passed on through sort of his ancestors, but also it's something related to what Freud calls archaic inheritance. So it's connected to transgenerational trauma. So it is, this unconditional love is very much connected to trauma because it's connected to the trauma of slavery. And I would argue that the unconditional hate is on the other side, as it's the sort of affect that the masters had for the slaves. That these are not human beings; these are things. So they do not deserve to be treated with respect. They're not human. They're objects. They're commodities to be exploited, right? And so that's the unconditional hate coming from that side. And so that's not, this counter legacy is something that he learns about from society in the form of anti-black racism, right? And so it's something that he internalizes. And of course, the confusion, the confusion that I try to talk about is like, especially with the worsening of his psychotic symptoms after 2016, especially with paranoid delusions, you can see how this internalization of anti-black racism, it gets projected in the form of anti-Semitism. So in other words, I would say that his anti-Semitism is a form of self-hatred, right? Because he is externalizing this, how he's being otherized onto another group in order to kind of displace that, right? Instead of kind of working through it, which he did before, which I referred to as tragic sublimation. And this is reflected also not only in his subjectivity, but in his aesthetics, in his politics, in his ethics. So we see all these shifts. That's why I talk about the farcical turns since 2022, because he repeats Donda, right? But first as tragedy, Donda 1, right? Then as farce, Donda 2, which is like a farcical repetition of the tragic, right? So the tragic sublimation, I think, is the part that we admire about him that makes him relevant.
All right. So the first tragic expression of the death of his mother obviously came through 808 and Heartbreak, which
Hmm.
probably is one of his most important albums. But your claim is that it was not something which was fully a stage of mourning.
Mm.
It was something much more immediate and therefore not satisfactory in terms of the process of overcoming the trauma of the death of his mother.
Yes.
But you know, my favorite album actually came out around that same time, My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy.
Yes.
Why is it my favorite? Because I believe, Robert, and I want your take on this. Uh, this bipolar structure was so evident now externally for the first time for Kanye in this society after 2008, because he is who is he sampling? He's sampling Gil Scott Heron the
Right.
most, who's a radical black militant
Mm.
of the a critic of the new left, a very very interesting poet, spoken
Mm.
word poet. But he's talking about the highs and lows of America. Who will survive in America?
Mm.
Right? He's prophesying the new class struggle. So 2008 happens. His mother dies around that same time. We all know that, like, the concept of Freud is that a trauma happens and you have what's called a latency period. So you don't process that trauma. It takes a certain time, which
Yes.
is why I thought that was a prophetic album, because he's actually pointing to something that is happening of a new divisions, which take the form of racial divisions, but economic divisions as well, right? These splits of rich and poor, a new survivalist economy.
Mm. Hmm.
It's my favorite album, yeah. With 808 and Heartbreak, he uses the what is the name of that voice technology that he sings into?
Something like a vocoder. Um, yeah.
That
So there's a lot of distortion
a
of
lot
his
of
voice. He's
distortion
using
is
it as an
used.
instrument.
Yeah, that is in some ways you could say, Robert, related to the motif of the mask, which in a future
Hmm.
point I want you to theorize and help us understand what the mask means for him.
Yes.
But tell us more about the tragic and the
Yes.
death of the mother, but also how, if you agree, this internal external relation works for him, where he's theorizing his tragic condition and he's also theorizing
Hmm.
society's tragic condition, especially after '08.
Hmm.
Have you thought about it that way?
The thing about 808 and Heartbreak is his most emotional album and has been very influential, especially on a new generation of rappers who are, like mumble a lot. So it's more about emotion than what they're saying. And he had a big influence on the whole new generation that we see now, especially with trap. And they all refer to that album as their masterpiece. But the key affect in that album was that he was engaged with Alexis Pfeiffer, his partner at the time, and they broke up before. So the album is really about that. It's not about mourning his mom. So he's kind of like avoiding the question of his mother's death because it's too traumatic. And again, he doesn't address it until Donda many years later. So that's that for 808. It's kind of like you could say it's latent, but the more I would say direct manifest grieving happens later with Donda. For Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy, that one was kind of in many ways, it's considered his masterpiece, magnum opus or what have you. But in many ways, it was kind of a response to a scandal, which was when he interrupted Taylor Swift at the Grammys or at the MTV Music Awards, I think, where he said, "I'm gonna let you finish, but Beyonce had the best music video of all time, right?" And he was drunk at the time. Again, why was he so drunk? That's his way of dealing with grief, but um, he claims that this is what made Taylor Swift famous, this moment of interruption. And many people, again, in the Black community, identified with this as like a radical move of interrupting white supremacy or what have you. But anyways, it was such a big scandal, and a lot of people obviously were against him for that. So he went to Hawaii and made My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. So he's like, this is his comeback. Like, you cannot define me as just this joker who's doing these interruptions in culture, but I'm a very serious artist and I have something to say, right? And so that's his comeback, and of course, it was impressive. And of course, Jesus is another important album after that, because it completely changes. I think he gets much more experimental with his sound, a lot more distortion, a good mix between minimalism and maximalism, but also the identification with Jesus, uh, which foreshadows the Antichrist argument, I would say. And then also his use of the voice. And you asked me about the voice in the mass. I think this is, if I would say the central, most powerful aspect of his work, I would say is his use of the voice and the gaze. And so the use of masks starts all the way back to College Dropout, when he's wearing the bear mascot, and it develops over time to all kinds of masks, right? And the point of that, again, the gaze for Lacan is not, I think it gets confused with looking, but a gaze is being looked at. So when we're looking at the bear mascot, the gaze would be how the bear is looking at us and making us feel, how it's causing our desire, right? And the point of that, the mask here, is that it's a screen. So it's blocking us from seeing Ye. And by doing that, we get to project our fantasies onto the bear and imagine what Ye is like or who he is. So he plays with this idea a lot. So it plays with the idea of what does it mean to be a celebrity, and that's why I think, distances himself. Also, my argument is that Kanye West refers to a project and an object, a commodity object, a celebrity, a project that involves many artists, many collaborations, many albums, but also fashion, all kinds of projects, videos. And then Ye is the subject that is sort of rises from the ashes of the psychotic break after 2016. So that Ye, the subject, we encounter for the first time after 2016, and he's saying. So a lot of people find that disturbing, that they prefer Kanye West the object, Kanye West the celebrity commodity. They don't want to see the authentic manic depressive subject, right? In the raw experience, right?
Wow. Yeah, this is very powerful, and Ye itself is a reference, according to what I read in your book,
Hmm.
of an interpretation of the word "you" in the Bible,
Yes.
but also could be meant as something sort of referring to both you but also us. It's like
Yes.
it's some claim on the status of the universal. So it's in your framework, it would be Ye is the subsumption into the unconditional love as
Hmm.
such in some way. And then so your argument is that from the standpoint of the analysis of his ongoing psychosis, this was allowed through actually, so correct me if I'm wrong here, just so I'm following. This was allowed, the assumption of this subject was allowed through a psychotic break of and a foreclosure of
Mm.
the imaginary father.
Mm.
Um, now, what I'm interested in this whole point here is Ye's theory, right? Of which is something that I have a hard time with, and I think
Mm.
many people do as well. Like maybe you could help us understand it. Like how is he trying to what is his claim? Yeah, regarding the agency of Black people in
Mm.
America, right? Because in a certain way, you could almost understand Ye as punctuated by these outburst statements, right? George Bush hates Black people. Slavery is a choice. You know, all
Mm.
these outlandish statements. Um, how we interpret those, it becomes interesting because
Mm.
it's, in a sense, is this a proper way of thinking about it? Is he sort of trying to give us the equipment that he himself has developed to manage his own bipolar psychosis, so that others under a similar condition right? Experiencing the same social fragmentation
Mm.
and oppression and racism and so on. Could he be understood as an artist that's trying to give us what he calls dragon energy?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is that what he wants the listener to get? Like, here's my special power, here's
Yeah.
my alchemy, you can do it too. That
Well,
kind of
I think he's I distinguish. So, I mean, if we think about manic depression, the way I think about that, like from a Lacanian perspective, from a psychoanalytic perspective, the subject is divided between ego and unconscious. So this is everyone. What's different between that, let's say, neurotic subject and a psychotic? Well, there's kind of an extreme version of division. So it's not only ego and unconscious, but we have melancholia on one side and mania on the other, right? So these extreme states. So it's not just ego and unconscious, and that's why everything is super exaggerated. So you got these manic statements. We also got a lot of experiences of melancholia captured aesthetically or even politically, because he does have a political rally where he's in tears. So you can see the melancholia, right? So there's that. I think there's a lot of things. I think we admire him the most and we benefit from him the most when he's aligned with the legacy of unconditional love, which is, again, you can think of that as the mother's desire. When he's sort of subjectifying the mother's desire, um, this is when he's doing the tragic sublimation. This is when he's producing the best work. This is when he's talking about love. This is when he seems prophetic in the most inspiring way. And again, it's still happening within psychosis, but I call it in terms of because it's not enough to just think about mania and depression, but also I think about their creative and destructive aspects. So that what I would call creative mania in some cases, or creative depression in some cases. How to channel those difficult experiences of your subjectivity in a creative way so that it could be of benefit not just to yourself but to the collective. And in that way, he is a very meaningful figure for many people. But unfortunately, there's also this death-driven aspect, which related to destructive mania and destructive depression, and is connected with this other legacy, the counter legacy, that has to do with not his ancestry or how his mom brought him up, but how the society. So to summarize, I would say I kind of offer a holographic reading. You know how a hologram works. Like if you zoom in on a hologram, the whole is in the part, right? So in a way, I see that Ye, in many ways, is interesting as a subject in his singularity, because by zooming in on him in a holographic way, we can understand something about American society, right? In terms of racial dynamics, in terms of class struggle, right? In terms of celebrity culture, right? And the effects of that, especially on someone with that kind of fractured subjectivity. And of course, I think there's a shift that happens. He's very well liked and successful when he's just a commodity, when he's Kanye West, that could be exploited by the labels, right? But when he becomes Ye, even if he becomes fascistic, but there's an ethics of subjectivity here of like, this is who I am. You might not like it, but this is what I think. And I think this way because this is something that exists in society and I'm reflecting it back to you. You might think
Mm,
it's ugly, right? But
right.
it's there. I didn't create it out of nowhere.
Yeah, that's the feeling I get with this concept of the dragon energy, which I want to invite you to say something about, as well as the theory of alchemy. And what I frankly feel is what I connect with him, right? It's that feeling that I had when I first listened to College Dropout, right? Which is um, one gets a sense of the inner like self turmoil and abuse and dejection, but one gets the sense that there's this like radical reappropriation of
Hmm.
that. And you can't help but be like very motivated and very inspired in some sense, because he's connecting uh with that sense of self-hatred, right? um so I guess my question is, what is, because you make a claim, by the way, that once Kanye, and we'll get to this in a moment, once Kanye falls into fascism, he loses the power of the dragon energy.
Yes.
So what is dragon energy, and
Sure.
how do you theorize that? And then we'll get to the fascism question
So one
too.
of the things that I write about in the book, there are different periods in his, he's been around officially for 20 years, right? Now it's 2024. College Dropout came out in 2004. So it's not easy for an artist to be around for that long and to remain relevant. But anyways, there are different periods in his career that reflect different aesthetics and also different interests of his and different shifts in his subjectivity. So the period that I focus on, obviously, in the book is what I call the Shaky-Ass Years, from 2016 to 2021. And that's the period that usually most people, most fans are not interested in. But it's the period that I find the most interesting. So that's the period where you don't have like major masterpieces like Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy or Yeezus or 808 or all the classics, but you have minor masterpieces. And this is the period when he's officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder or manic depression, working through that. And then it culminates with the release of Donda. So you can see how this journey inwards, he's able to access this grief regarding his mom. But then, and then he ends up becoming like almost a multi-billionaire because he had like $2 billion. So it's the peak of his career in many ways. He has a deal with Gap, and Adidas and Balenciaga, and so by 2021 he's at his peak in terms of like the capitalist system, artistically as well, and he destroys all of that. So he reaches the top and he's like, "Fuck it, I'm just gonna." I'm gonna sabotage all of this. But the dragon energy concept is his own concept that he comes up with. It's something that he describes that Trump has as well. He admires about Trump. Um, but basically, he's saying that this dragon energy is what I would say is tragic sublimation, is how to channel negativity and suffering into something creative. Um, and there are some interventions that are, again, dismissed, which I talk about, like Make America Great. He creates a sort of an intervention there. Instead of Make America Great Again, he removes the again to say that there's no fantasy of greatness that we can return to, but we can make America great, right? So I think this is an important intervention that kind of is dismissed or overlooked. But anyways, so that's the dragon energy concept of. It's also related to a bit of a Nietzschean point about his bipolarity, where in his Ye album he writes on the cover, "I hate being bipolar. It's awesome." So a very paradoxical statement, but in the album he talks about how bipolarity is not a weakness but a power. So I kind of, so that's kind of the dragon energy idea, is like, you're diagnosed with this. Should I just like, get depressed and not do anything, or do I somehow use this, own it, and transform it into some kind of creative power and do something with it? So that's his concept there.
And then maybe this is a good time to ask why, in his fascist turn,
Hmm.
would he lose the tragic paradigm or the tragic way of accessing his enjoyment? Like, why is that absent? That's an interesting.
Yeah.
It's an interesting theory regarding the psychoanalysis of artistic creation,
Yes.
right?
Well, I would say, if we go back to what I said earlier, so there are three foreclosures that happen, and so 22 marks the third foreclosure. So 2004 is the foreclosure of the symbolic father, uh, anti-intellectualism, college dropout. So that he begins already with a foreclosure, but it's an accepted one, right? 2016 is the foreclosure of the real father, so anti-radicalism. He comes out directly as pro-Trump for the first time, basically going against the liberal status quo. You expect me as a black subject to vote Democrat no matter what? No, I'm going in that direction. Of course, he's also rebelling against his parents, his mom being a member of the civil rights movement, his dad being a Black Panther. So it's clearly, that's a big part of the motivation. But then within that shaky ass period, he's still connected with the legacy of unconditional love because radical Christianity is still at work there, right? So There's the Sunday service. There's a lot of messaging about love throughout this period. But then after the end of this period, somehow when he successfully mourns his mother and is over that, that doesn't get rid of the melancholia. That's the mourning piece, right? So he left it for this long to address it. But then what about the loss of his own self, right? Because that's the melancholia. The depression of melancholia is not that you're losing someone else, but you're losing yourself, right? So there's the third foreclosure here, which I would say is the foreclosure in 2022 of the imaginary father, and that's why he abandons Christianity and moves into Christian nationalism, right? So it's a farcical version of Christianity. It's and so in many ways you could see, even artistically, everything becomes caricature and farcical, politically, aesthetically, and that's why this fascist turn, uh, you listen to Donda too is an incomplete album that was released, right? So there's a sense of not putting in the work, not, and that's happens after again the accumulation of the three foreclosures, right? And that lead to that specific moment, right?
So the idea then would be that this dragon energy and the bipolarity of universal hate, universal love, and the capacity to sublimate that, to take the lowest of lows and convert it into a commodity through
Hmm.
Kanye West, has now kind of been disrupted.
Yes.
Could you like, that's the most interesting point to me, is the sense of how this new relationship, yeah, to the loss of this third foreclosure
Mm,
is affecting his capacity to harness the dragon energy
mm,
and to create the commodity that will be consumed and that will be valorized.
right.
Is that a result of his ideological marginalization
Mm,
from, right? Or is it actually a psychodynamic, yeah,
yeah.
that is like, has he somehow crippled his capacity, or not crippled, but sort of entered into a space in which it's no longer able to function, right?
Yeah.
Something's broken down. Something's
Yeah.
broken down.
Yeah.
Say a bit more about that. That's very
There's
interesting.
definitely a failure of Kanye West as a project, and the project is rejected by the mainstream because after his anti-Semitic remarks, he tweeted in 2022, of course, I'm going DEFCON 3 on Jewish people, but he didn't write DEFCON, he wrote DEathCon. So it was an interesting slip there, and that resulted in him being dropped by talent agency, a very prominent one that was run by Rahm Emanuel's brother. Uh, and So the whole liberal capitalist establishment turns against him. He gets dropped by Adidas, he gets dropped by Balenciaga. He loses a lot of money. So he had, like, I think $2 billion. He's now very poor. He has, like, I think 400 million or something. So, but I think one way to look at it, I think the capitalist angle is an interesting one because at 2021, that's the height of, uh, like, in terms of class, this is the height of his wealth. So by the end of 2021, he has $2 billion. And he feels, and this is something he talks about throughout, like this glass ceiling idea, that he always compares himself to Michael Jackson. That Michael Jackson, at first they didn't want to play his music videos on MTV, right? And he had to kind of break that glass ceiling, and you know because he was considered too urban or what have you. So with Ye, he always struggled with this idea as a fashion designer, because again, the reason why I think he's such an important figure is because he's not just an artist. In many ways, I see him as a Wagnerian figure. This idea of Gesamtkunstwerk, right? The total work. So he's not just a musician, a music producer. He's also a fashion designer. He makes films, and so in many ways, as an artist, he is impressive. But the problem with that and having manic depressive subjectivity at the same time and being put in the position under capitalism of being that rich, right? it's, I think, the combination of those factors. That's why I try to see the polarization of the United States politically, right? It's hyperpolarization. Obviously, it's kind of a fake polarization because at the end of the day, the liberal conservative is a status quo. That's the status quo. It's not about class struggle, right? But he even feels, with $2 billion, he still feels like he's seen as a black man no matter what. He feels racialized. And instead of kind of working through that in a rational or radical way, again, it gets displaced. It becomes like self hatred. It becomes an identification with white supremacy. It becomes, he hangs out with people like Nick Fuentes, who worked for him, Milo Yiannopoulos, Gavin McInnes, Proud Boys, Alex Jones. He talks about identifying with Hitler, right? What is that all about, right? Um, and of course, he gets used by these people who might not even like him, but they like his money, right?
Mm,
And they are taking advantage of the fact that he is suffering and confused, right? And so it's all these factors. Of course, his mom is not around to take care of him. I mean,
mm,
that's the thing with psychosis. It's like the mom, the big other, uh, losing that. Like, who's gonna tell him what to do? He's completely lost. Um, yeah. So Candis Owens is another figure. So all these Christian nationalists, right? So it turns into, it goes from unconditional love to unconditional hate. It goes to the other end of the spectrum, right? Toward fascism, toward anti-Semitism, and it's all, again, resulting from, subjectively, all these foreclosures: the anti-radicalism, the anti-intellectualism, the anti-Christ position, but also, again, as a microcosm of what's happening in the United States. The United States itself is kind of going through that hyperpolarization of the United States, which is kind of, again, fake, because it's not about class struggle. But like the election, Trump versus Kamala, we're hyperpolarized, as if like somehow it's kind of putting us in a psychotic position, right? And that's how I would read it. Yeah.
this is very helpful because I think a lot of folks that look at Ye, they say they have a theory of narcissism tied to what you might call an instrumentalized theory of the ego.
Mm,
So in this sense, you could in that framework, you could say, well, he only went to Trump because that's also that's capable of better fulfilling the bottom line of the Kanye West project itself,
hmm.
because the country was headed in that direction. So it's opportunistic.
Yeah.
But your model is different, and I want folks listening to pay attention to this, which is it's a theory that actually it's a theory that actually Kanye already has sort of cessated his ego in some sense, and
Yeah.
that interests me because I think in pop psychology we have the notion that cessation of the ego is like rare, but
Mm,
also like universally perceived as liberatory. However, in this instance, for a psychotic cessation of ego without a stabilizing force,
yeah.
such as Donda, um, it can actually regress the subject back into this condition
Yes.
where they can no longer tap into what made Kanye possible to begin with,
Yes.
which was this tragic paradigm of so so therefore you could say, and correct me if you see it differently, Ye needs imaginary stabilizing force as a
Yes.
precondition for his creative genius.
Yes, absolutely. Trump is an imaginary father figure. That's clear what he is. But he even goes beyond him. So, I mean, he has a period where he's enamored with him. But recently he met with him at Mar-a-Lago with Nick Fuentes, and they had a fight, and it was reported in the media. And so Ye asked Trump to be his vice president, like, because Ye has been flirting with running for president, right? Uh, and Nick Fuentes was working for him, working for his campaign. So again, he's definitely more right than Trump. So he kind of went beyond Trump in many ways. At this point, I just see like the fascism becoming more and more concrete in his aesthetics. I see an aestheticization of politics, I see a lot of flirtation with Nazi aesthetics and fascist aesthetics in general, in terms of his mass rallies and listening parties, um, how they look. I even compare them visually to the Triumph of the Will, and you can see that aesthetically there's a lot of resemblance. And this is something that he doesn't hide. Like, he explicitly has flirted with Confederate aesthetics. He has flirted with the KKK as an aesthetic. Like, that he has a famous video where he's wearing the KKK hood, but it's in black instead of white. So again, I see this, aesthetic of subversion or what have you. But I think Lasurda's concept of aristocratic radicalism is useful here, or aristocratic rebellion. I mean, it seems like rebellion, it seems like radicalism, but what does it really ultimately lead to? And it is regressive, it is reactionary. And the regressive point is a really good one that I go into in details, because it's regressing to pre-Oedipal stages. It's regressing to pre-Oedipal forms of sexuality. And we
Mm,
can see that he talks a lot about his addiction to porn, for example. It's something that he doesn't stop talking about. But he went from that to wanting to start a porn company, and at some
mm,
point actually doing a collaboration with Pornhub.
hmm,
So, and then he blames his father for his porn addiction, because he says when he was 5, his father had a Playboy magazine somewhere on the table in the living room. He found it when he was 5 years old, and that he got hooked ever since, and that's been his addiction, right? But what is that about, right? Interestingly, again, the sexual dimension is important psychoanalytically to think about, and its relationship to politics, right? He dated what's her name? This famous actress for like a month, and she said in her memoir that they never had sex.
hmm,
So he just loved dressing her up, and so he, again, in terms of like sexual politics, and there's a lot there we can also learn from Willem Reich in terms of the sexual dimension of fascism and how sexuality features.
mm,
Um, so that's something that I've definitely paid close attention to, especially since Vultures, his newest release, Vultures 1 and 2. Um, yeah, so, and how the crowd relates to him sexually too. The You see this in fascist rallies. It's like a collective sadistic uh, experience. It's kind of like reminiscent of the old Colosseum experience of like watching someone being slain or eaten by a lion, and enjoying that, watching that kind of sadism. There's a
hmm.
lot of tapping into that in his recent aesthetics.
So, yes, I want to shift to a conversation regarding psychoanalysis and the theory of fascism.
Mm,
Maybe we could start with getting a sense, in your view, what are sort of some of the best systems of thought within the psychoanalytic register, for theorizing fascism? I mean, I have my own views on this. I'm very
yeah,
curious. I'm very curious to see your thought. I mean, because on the one hand, there's a Marxist impulse inside of me, Robert,
yes.
that would want to say that it would be idealist to psychologize fascism,
Hmm, hmm.
or that, and I'm not suggesting that you're doing that, um, but that to do so would, be, run the risk of being either sort of ahistorical, or not providing a proper materialist, and here by materialist I mean, properly social grounding
Yeah,
of fascism, or reducing fascism to a psychical structure for which the problem would be, um its method of generalization is somehow too easy, or it's not contingent on actual events. So can you navigate
yeah.
how do you first pose the bridge between psychoanalytic model of
Yeah.
interpretation and the question of fascism?
No, that's a great question. I mean, I do write about it in the preface in terms of fascism as false being, um, in the sense not to psychologize, but I think at the end of the day, we do have to theorize the individual and the collective at the same time, dialectically, right? So we have to think about, yes, fascism is basically authoritarian capitalism. Like if we were to kind of simply define it, right? Like what we have, the model that's the alternative is like somehow democratic capitalism. And so fascism is authoritarian capitalism with these nationalistic and racist dimensions, right? And so the psychoanalytic question becomes, well, this is the structure in terms of like if, political economy and but how does it map onto subjectivity, whether individual or collective? And this is where we think about the sexual question. And I think the key here is the question of the connection between being reactionary and being regressive. There is a strong connection between regressive reactionary politics, right? They're sort of the reactionary politics of fascism, with their nationalism, with their racism, uh, ultimately manifest in terms of regressive sexuality. Okay, so we see a lot of pre-Oedipal fantasies. And that's in terms of the aesthetics, in terms of the politics, in terms of the ethics. And this is, again, Walter Benjamin wrote about this in terms of when he was looking at the rise of fascism in Germany, in terms of the aestheticization of politics. At the end of the day, if you think about Hitler, as a leader, he was also a performing artist. Hitler was a failed artist. Hitler was designed the logo for the Nazi flag. Like you have, so I don't think we can separate just the material aspect, the politics and the economics, from the aesthetic dimension, which appeals to people and draws them in. And there's seduction of the leader. Like I think a big part of fascistic politics is the father figure who's seducing the masses, and there's this identification, and it's very much sexually charged. If you think about how people relate to Trump or Ye in this case, it's very much can be described in those terms. So Hitler's so-called charisma, his as a performer, so this performance aspect, his use of aesthetics, the design of buildings or the uniform, Hugo Boss, right? So these are all important dimensions. Same thing with Ye. Ye is a designer. He thinks in terms of aesthetics, but the problem is he's aestheticizing politics, and this is a fascistic tendency, right? The reverse of that, the radical socialist alternative, according to Benjamin, is to politicize aesthetics, not to fall into the trap of reducing politics to aesthetics, but to how to politicize aesthetics. And Ye has done that before, and those are the instances that you refer to as radical when he's citing Jill Scott Heron, right? And that's a politicization of aesthetics, and you felt it, and it was real, right?
Yeah, this is good because one of my mentors is a Freudian analyst by the name of Larry Rickles, and he has two books called Nazi Psychoanalysis. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them,
Mm,
but one of his arguments about the psychoanalysis of fascism is actually kind of connected to your sort of idea of false being,
mm-hmm,
in the sense that for him, he thinks that the object of the fascist community is about the resurrection of a fusion with the missing mother. That,
mm-hmm,
like, it's a kind of, therefore, you could say collective psychosis in some sense, in
mm,
which the current social order, and here it's actually anti-liberal primarily because
mm-hmm,
the current order is liberal, um, has deprived us, the fascist community,
mm-hmm.
of a harmonious, and
Yes.
the key point would be on a missing harmony that
Mm,
the militancy is meant to restore. So that's the interesting point that I want people listening to pick up on. It's not about the end. Let's say the end is not about necessarily a reaffirmation of a patriarchal authority per
mm-hmm,
se. No, Rickles says it's actually about the construction of a society in which the problem of the missing mother and
mm-hmm.
the problem of harmonious social being is finally solved. But the precondition of solving it requires the elimination of
Right.
agents that are deemed to be promoting the current social order, which is a
Yes.
disharmony. So that's actually what I wanted to ask you. If we roll with that, right?
Yeah.
How might we fit that into the matrices of the Kanye fascist turn, right? Like, in some sense, like, who are the new enemies? Yeah. Like, you know what I mean? Because I mean, we first of all also have to ask, like, because a lot of people have talked about post-racial fascism with Fuentes, and
Mm-hmm.
it's 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 a new
Right.
it's a new list of enemies in some way. Um, so it's white supremacy, but it's also slightly reconfigured from white supremacy as we used to know it.
Yeah. Christian nationalism too.
Help us
No,
with that, please.
that's a really good reading, and it definitely maps onto how I read Ye's fascist turn in terms of the pre-Oedipal, because the pre-Oedipal fantasy is a fantasy of union with the mother. And so, in many ways, if you think about this regression, it's also Make America Great Again. This return, this fantasy of a return to greatness. What is this greatness? This oneness, right? This harmony that never existed. It's something that's constructed after the fact, après coup, right? Uh, and um, and in this fantasy, and this is a big part of the fascist fantasy, is this idealization of nature, right? So the people who are get eliminated typically are people who are associated with culture, right? Like in the case of Nazi Germany, the Jews were considered like part of culture, not nature, because Nazis were obsessed with nature. Heidegger is big on this, right? Idealizing, romanticizing nature. Let's go back to nature. Let's go back to the mother nature, right? And anyone that's outside of that needs to be eliminated. So what is outside of that? Well, it's culture, it's modernity, it's rationalism, right? It's reason, all those things, and that's why again, it's aesthetics becomes the mean for doing to achieve this. I mean, think about it. Like Trump, the hat becomes the key signifier. It's an aesthetic marker, right? So again, Ye understands this as a designer, and this is why he's into this. Even when he talks about, I mean, I do make a lot of comparisons between him and Nietzsche, and you're the Nietzsche scholar, but he talks about the hat, the MAGA hat. It makes him feel like Superman. He compares it to Superman cape. Okay, so again, like all this Ubermensch fantasy. So again, he's saying this. I'm sure a lot of Trump supporters feel that way too. When they wear the MAGA hat, they feel like Superman.
Mm.
What is that about, right?
Yeah. No, it's really interesting because, in a sense, it's very clear to me as somebody on the left that um, the peak of Ye's militancy was Hurricane Katrina in 2005 when he said George Bush hates black people. Because that was a truly subversive, a truly transgressive thing to say. Whereas this post 2016, post 2021 turn to fascism
Mm,
is what Badiou's definition of fascism is rendering obscure one's relationship to history and to
mhm,
time and to what Badiou will call the event. So fascism produces what Badiou calls an obscure subject. And I feel that, like, in some sense, yeah, my two favorite moments from Ye were that Hurricane Katrina moment and the post 2008 release of My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy.
mhm,
That's me personally speaking. But one of the things I do want to ask you is, because I was speaking to a comrade last night who's like a religious fanatic for Ye, and we were debating, does Kanye have anything left? Like,
mhm.
can he get out of this pre-Oedipal uh predicament that he is in, and how might he be reborn
Yeah,
back into the symbolic? Because
yeah,
I think in some ways Lacan's theory of the symbolic
yeah.
um is what's most terrifying to the fascist movement.
Mhm.
And when Kanye has a proper positioning to the symbolic, and he can bring his alchemy, his dragon energy, and he can make his interventions,
Yeah,
there's something very, very, very profound, very, very emancipatory, very, very liberating. And I think you recognize that.
Yeah.
And everyone is very sad that he has fallen into this
Right.
situation.
Right.
Is there any way out? And what would that look like?
The way it looks right now, I don't see a way out. I see, because what I see over time is a worsening of psychotic symptoms. So again, worsening of things like paranoid delusions, like blaming Jews for everything. Um, and that coincides very well with fascism too. Um, but yeah, I guess the silver lining would be something like the symptom. Um, him holding together his subjectivity, reconfiguring it in a different way. Um, and if he's able to go from his anti-radicalism, anti-intellectualism, and anti-Christ stance to radicalism, to intellectualism, to embracing radical Christianity, perhaps there's a chance for him. But that's like a 180-degree shift that he would have to desire, right? Obviously, that's what his mother would desire for him. So if he wants to be authentic in terms of subjectifying the other's desire, the mother's desire, subjectifying the legacy of unconditional love, then this is where he would go. So I guess it's a possibility. Is it highly probable? Probably not.
That makes sense because, on the one hand, when you say the mother, as what Lacan in a technical sense would say, that's actually what he calls the name of the father.
Yeah.
So, in some ways, actually, the position of the mother is the position of the father in a technical
Yes.
sense,
Symbolic father. Yes.
which means that when Kanye is most, because the function for Lacan of for a psychotic, what's most rare is that they have the capacity to, what Lacan says, make metaphor,
Hmm.
make meaning.
Hmm.
And I think it's very interesting to think about meaning making on behalf of an artist who is psychotic, because the meaning that they are making as a psychotic is foreclosed from a shared symbolic,
Mm.
right? It's purely like detached from the symbolic. And so whatever he does to come back, it would have to be some rapport would have to be had with that version of the mother that is the stand-in ultimately for the status quo in some sense, right? Like
Right.
all of the things that he thinks are his enemies. He
Right.
has to find a way to uh to combat them from a way that is non-fascistic.
Yes. And as
I
I
guess,
say,
you
fascism
know,
is false being. So at the end of fascism for him, not necessarily to go to authentic being, right? But I think he did lose himself. This is the melancholia piece. It's like he's grieving loss of self, right? And this loss of self corresponds to the fascistic turn. So he would have to somehow find himself, and that's really hard. Again, with the worsening of psychotic symptoms, how do you find yourself within that, right? And
so then this I want to roll with this concept of false beings. So for you, move like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like movements of fascism are seeking a collective solution to a pervasive sense of interior falseness that is somehow sort of mutually shared, or the community has this
mm,
negative um, solidarity around a project that would be militantly political, that is ultimately around resolving that sense of falseness through then the creation of a solution which would be premised on um, you know, profound sacrifice, violence, any means necessary,
yeah.
and so on. I mean, it sounds like in some ways, if that's true, I wonder how you might fit communism or
Mhm.
a a, a proper militancy that would be in opposition to that,
Yeah.
right? Right. I wonder if
I
you've
can make
thought
that
about.
distinction. Yeah, I have. So I would say that the fascistic relies on imaginary politics of sameness. That's how I would say it. So what they have in common might be that this false sense or false being, right? That's something that they identify with as a kind of common symptom that's connecting them. It becomes a social tie of sorts. But it's because it's an imaginary politics of sameness, aesthetics becomes the key way to express that. And this the concept of the spectacle I think is important here. Like, yeah, is Trump, Ye, they're always working with spectacles, right? And being enamored with the spectacle, falling in love with the spectacle. So they aestheticize politics this way, but it's a politics of sameness, and this is why it doesn't have room for difference. For me, radicalism, socialism, is a politics of difference that relies on different dynamics. It relies on symbolic desire, which is what do we collectively want as comrades, right? But it also relies on the question of enjoyment. What is it that we want that would make us enjoy together as a group? And it doesn't fall into the trap of imaginary identification, because it's not about falling in love with a certain leader. It's not about falling in love with a certain aesthetic, right? But it's about falling in love with a certain politics and a certain ethics.
It is interesting because in a certain way, one of the things we didn't broach is Kanye's theory, if you think he has one, of resentment at a collective level.
Mm-hmm.
I get the feeling that this theory that Ye has regarding, and we didn't talk about this, but I want to invite you to say something about it. His controversial statement that slavery was a choice.
Yeah.
Let me just ask you straight out, like, how you understand that, how that fits into his fascist, because
Yeah.
he could have only said that on condition of inhabiting this false being, right? It's like a stage.
Right.
At this stage, he could utter such a ludicrous statement. But then how is that? Because, but you know, like, honestly, it's not as a statement. It sounds outlandish, but I would
Mm-hmm.
actually argue that that's what most fascists really do think.
Right. Right. So he said slavery sounds like a choice to him on TMZ. So explaining his perspective here, not saying that I agree with him, but the way he thinks about it, he regards himself as a futurist, and as you know, futurism and fascism pretty much connected, especially in Italian fascism, right? Which has to do with a relationship with the past and how to read history. As you said, it's ahistorical, but basically, he had this alternative to Black History Month. He doesn't like the idea of blackness being associated with what he sees as negative features, slavery, racism. And he wants to distance himself from that. So futurism for him offers him the opportunity of reconstructing blackness as something else, according to him. So it's a way he wants to cut with history. And again, his mother's lesson was the legacy, this archaic inheritance, to use Freud from Moses and monotheism, this archaic inheritance, like Freud talks about the legacy of Jewish people, that they inherit some kind of traumatic suffering over time that makes them make sense of their identity, collective identity, as, you know, what does it mean to be Jewish? Same thing for when it comes to being Black in the United States and having this history of slavery in the background and the experience of racism, etc. For Donda, the way to make sense of that trauma is through the legacy of unconditional love. Is that, yes, there's this negative legacy that we experience, but because God loves us and we are worthy beings, we're human, there's goodness in us, and that gives us the drive to do good and to be good. And, you know, when he's aligned with this legacy, he's doing his best work, because that's kind of like he's focused, right? He's like he's aligned with the mother's desire, right? um this futurism, again, this tends to be on the fascistic side, which is, yeah, rejecting history, trying to reinvent history.
Well,
Yeah.
exactly, and it's also, I think it also has an impact on Kanye, the philosopher of society,
Mm,
because he now will think that Black Lives Matter as a slogan is contributing to a perpetual cycle of self-hatred.
yes.
That's why he wants to say with Candis Owens and wear the
Right.
shirt "White Lives Matter."
Exactly.
So his theory, therefore, of social antagonisms is funneled back in through the fascist imaginary.
Right.
In some ways, there's only the individual imaginary, like this monad, and that, like, society's antagonisms are not. They are a fiction. maybe you could say it that way. Like, you know what I mean? Because then in that sense, he has foreclosed real oppression. He's
Right.
foreclosed actual exploitation. But
Right.
he acknowledged it. One of the things we didn't say is you use, of course, the concept of double consciousness
Mm-hmm.
as what situated his bipolarity in the symbolic and
Mm-hmm.
allowed Kanye West as a commodity and brand to be successful.
Yes.
But then the various foreclosures that you've articulated have extinguished his double conscious. So that's interesting too, because then if you think about the reinvention of Ye at this point in time, he's going to have to make some return to the symbolic, right? But we don't know what that's going to look like. I think you invoke this notion of Lacan's idea of the symptôme,
Right.
of this acknowledgement of an awareness of one's symptom that is death driven, that is never
Right.
fully extinguished. Yeah,
Right.
he's not in touch with that at all right now.
Yeah,
Um,
not now. But he even, I think, recently reframed his bipolarity in terms of autism, which is very interesting. Um, but um, but the question of anti-Semitism is also, I think, curious one to think about here. Um, Part of the reason why he blames Jewish people for everything, right, and in this irrational fashion, in this paranoid, delusional fashion, is because when he had his first big manic episode in 2016, and this wasn't in the during the concert or during the tour, but it was in the gym. His personal coach called the police. He was put on a psychiatric hold, so he was handcuffed to a gurney and forced hospitalized and forced medicated. His personal coach happens to be Jewish, so he has a lot of resentment from that experience. And recently, he actually shared a text back and forth between them where this coach was threatening to do the same to him again. So, again, as a critical psychologist, I have to take that seriously because uh, there's a lot going on at the same time. There's fascism, there's anti Semitism, but there's also a society, a structure that's capitalizing on someone's pain, someone's suffering, and using that as a threat. And there's a history, especially of psychosis, being connected with blackness,
mm,
statistically in terms of correlation. So, so that complicates things for him. But blackness, again, the lesson from Donda about what blackness means is not that it's necessarily some kind of essence. Like if we think of whiteness as an ideology that was created by the ruling class to divide people, to divide the working class, not as an ethnicity, but as an ideology. Blackness was an oppositional counter ideology against that.
mm,
So that's what it means, right? So to disidentify with that or to distance yourself from that and to go to anti-Semitism, you completely didn't learn the lesson that your
mm,
mother taught you, the radical lesson of what it means to be black. That it's not an essentialist identity; it's a
mm.
political position.
Yeah, because his current conception is that blackness, as I understand it, in this kind of neo-fascistic thing that he shares, because I watched his interview with Candis Owens,
Right,
um, is actually in their eyes, right, sort of stripping the inner God or stripping the inner
right,
divine, right?
right.
It's removing you from that. It's ultimately an association, maybe you could say, with like,
A negativity.
yeah, exactly. So but what they fail to see is the fact that this inevitably inhabits them with some kind of self-hatred for which it's
Exactly.
very difficult to escape.
That's internalization, which again he has to work through. That internalizing the legacy of unconditional hate, which is the legacy of anti-black racism.
I wanted to ask you, Robert, how people have received the argument you make in this book, and especially around the fascism question. Like,
Yeah.
how have those dialogues been going for you? Have you been surprised perhaps by any responses that you may have received or anything like that?
Well, I think the kind of the positive responses that I have received were from Black comrades who have found the book to be really meaningful, especially if they recognize this kind of suffering in themselves, in terms of, let's say, manic depression, which is quite common and hard to talk about. Um, so this sense of, taking someone's suffering seriously is, there's something empowering about that, whether that person is good or bad, or whether they're fascist or not. But again, as a psychoanalyst, I have to take suffering seriously. I have to listen to it. So there's that dimension. But also there's my political responsibility of not just seeing him as a genius, but also seeing the dangers in some of the things that he says and does. Now, this other reading, which is a more political one, about that one upset people, especially people that maybe find the fascism seductive. Have received sort of angry comments about, why do you read him as a fascist, or maybe he's not, and trying to defend him from that reading. When I tried to be as fair as possible, honestly, like I had to add that after the fact. I worked on that book for 7 years, and I was finished with it. I was happy, and then the fascist turn happened. I couldn't just like be silent and watch it as it was unfolding. I had to say something about it. It's my political and ethical responsibility.
And part of your argument, as I understand it, as we've articulated as well, is that there's a relationship between a collapse in what you call his tragic capacity to produce great art.
Yeah,
So ultimately, when he's in this stage, it has undermined his genius, which I think is a very
100%.
I think that's a very useful argument. I mean, that's not to say that. Well, I mean, I think actually you could conclude from that um, a number of things, which I find interesting when we just study other fascist artists, right? Like that's actually what your study makes me want to do. Is to uh,
That's good.
think about that. You know what I mean? Like the how that collapse or that breakdown in sublimation
Mm,
functions fascist. It's like a theory of fascism. So is there anything else you wanted to say that I may have neglected regarding the whole fascism? I know it's a huge
yeah.
topic. I mean, we could broach some other theories of fascism from like Wilhelm Reich or
Hmm.
from which I'm not as convinced of
Hmm.
personally,
Hmm.
or even some of the Deleuze and Guattari theories that appropriate Wilhelm Reich
Hmm.
in their theory of fascism as well. Because as I've written about, I feel that sometimes in the Deleuze Guattari, especially Anti-Oedipus Volume 1, right?
Yeah.
Like Foucault's Introduction, A Guide to Non-Fascist Living,
Yeah.
is what I find there is, let's say, on the good side of it, is a way of thinking about a becoming fascist
Hmm.
potential
Hmm.
that capitalism implants.
Hmm.
But then what often happens is a sense that um, there's almost a capacity for an overextension of that,
Hmm.
and then we lose the granularity to be able to discriminate fascist from non-fascist forms of becoming.
100%. No, I think their point about microfascism, the fascism of everyday life, that everyone has like a fascist inside somehow. It's helpful, interesting, especially to keep oneself in check. But at the same time, is useless if like everything is fascism, then nothing is fascism. So that's where it becomes, I think, useless in my opinion, because we do have to be able to distinguish things. What is fascist? What is anti-fascist? And how can we make sense of that? Also, like the romanticization of the pre-Oedipal, or the, you know, uh, I have a problem with that. I think this is a clear case where the Oedipal would be a good solution here. So, as we agreed, like the pre-Oedipal fantasies are a big feature of fascism, right? This oneness with the mother, this oneness with nature. And so the romanticization of psychosis is also undermining the suffering of psychotic subjects. So they're seeing the psychotic becomes the proletariat for them. and I don't agree with that. That's not my reading. I'm not saying that Ye here is a proletarian subject that represents what we should do as revolutionaries, but yeah, it's the opposite.
In my last show, Robert, I don't know if you got a chance to listen. I was interviewing a scholar of a French philosopher who's a critic of Deleuze and Guattari. His name is Michel Clouscard, and one of the things that he argues is that the theory of the psychotic proletariat is an aristocratic epistemology.
Absolutely.
But why? It's because what it actually ends up reinforcing, and this is a very interesting argument I hadn't thought about. In his view, he thinks that its logic reinforces a certain hierarchy of access to truth.
Mm,
So that um, because the psychotic's wisdom or truth or knowledge is of the imaginary in this particular way, it's very singular. The criticism is that this actually falls into neo-Kantianism,
hmm
whereby this noumenon truth, this kind of unknowable truth, becomes posited as the highest we could desire as a collective, right? So your theory of emancipation, therefore, is kind of parochial ultimately, and it's then elitist because like your assumption actually is like there's only fascists becoming, so you can kind of ride this way but not this way with it.
hmm hmm
So you blur the boundaries. Anyways,
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense to me, and I would say my alternative reading to Deleuze and Guattari is to say that it's a holographic reading of VA's psychotic subjectivity as a way to understand how capitalism, racial capitalism in particular, uh, sort of enforces and promotes the breakdown and these kinds of psychotic breaks. And that's not something to be celebrated or romanticized, but it's something to say that we have distress because of capitalism. And to understand this kind of distress that exists in society, here's one case study of like zooming in on this to understand something about the universe, the cosmos of capitalism. So that's how I see it.
Robert, this has been very fascinating interview and conversation. Thanks so much for coming back on the
Thank you.
program. What's on the horizon for you, Robert? By the way, just for the benefit of listeners, has translated a number of works from Arabic into English, and you do a lot of work in regards to Islamophobia,
hmm
um, anti-racism work in all different varieties. You are a musical artist, and you've been putting out a fair amount of music lately. I know
hmm
that's a big focus of yours.
Yeah.
But if I could ask you, like, in your theory production world, like
Yeah.
what's going on right now for you? What are you working on?
Right now, I'm working on a third volume that would be a sequel to Freud and Said. So, Decolonial Psychoanalysis, Freud and Said. They're the two books in a trilogy. And so, I'm writing the third part, which is on liberation psychoanalysis. And basically, I have some additional stuff on Ye's fascism, but I also talk about what's going on in Gaza, uh, writing about that as well. Um, and, just furthering my critique of psychoanalysis, which, as I always say, is a critique from a place of love. So it's a critique ultimately so that psychoanalysis can be better, can improve, and can be a tool for liberation, as opposed to sort of readings that reject psychoanalysis as completely colonial and worthless, which I don't agree with.
I love your work. I
Thank
wish you
you.
the best. I definitely want to help you continue to get the word out regarding your theories, your ideas. Robert's developing some things that are very kind of paradigm shifting in these fields, and it definitely does. Is definitely something that I admire. It's it's you're a man after my own heart. I think we both entered into the world of critical thought around the same time, and
Yeah.
we have very similar lines of influence.
Right.
One of Robert's points of influence, of course, we didn't mention is Zizek.
hmm
Um, but you have been critical of him,
Yeah.
but you've also acknowledged your debt
Yes.
to his thought. Maybe you need to write some kind of psychoanalytic biography of Slavoj Žižek.
I don't think so, but yeah.
I
But
would
yeah,
be
and thank you so much, Daniel. I really appreciate you, like the work that you do as an organizer, the sort of para-academic spaces that you create for people, and the study groups and all that. I really admire what you do. So it's mutual.
Thanks, brother. All right. Well, folks, until next time, take care.